Well, let's talk now about the rights of workers and the rights of employers in this new era of pot legalization in Canada. To do that, I'm joined by Karin Pagé. She's an employment lawyer and a partner at Purley, Robertson, Hill and McDougall. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in to talk about this. So, what do workers and workplaces need to know, kind of as we are on day one and moving forward of this new era of legal recreational cannabis in Canada?
So I'd say first and foremost, I mean, nothing really dramatic will change. Employers still have the right to control the use of recreational marijuana in the workplace, and to require that employees do not appear impaired, are not impaired when they show up for work.
Okay. So we've seen rules for police officers vary widely across the country. And in some cases, no consumption 28 days before a shift. In some cases, it's just the simple rule of show up fit for duty. And that's kind of left, I guess, to some degree to the discretion of officers. What are employers allowed to demand of employees in terms of cannabis use when they're off duty, when they're not in the workplace?
Right, so that will depend on your workplace and whether or not it's a safety sensitive position. So obviously police officers, and they're, carrying weapons and able to exert force, so that would be considered a safety sensitive position. So they could be, they would be able to regulate off-duty conduct more so than a typical office job could. So, I mean, certainly the fit for work test would apply to basically any workplace. However, if your employee is going to be using heavy machinery or driving a vehicle, that would suggest that the employer could impose greater restrictions.
We've seen, we suspect what we'll see is clearly a lessening of the stigma around cannabis usage, since it'll no longer be illegal recreationally. So, will we see, and does that presume that some employees who are consumers of cannabis will be more open with that consumption, and especially if it means they could be employees who require some special kind of accommodation in the workplace? So what does that mean for employers who might be forced to make special accommodations?
Yes, so very important for an employer to recognize that they may still have a duty to accommodate an employee who requires the use of cannabis for a medical condition, for instance. So that requires a case-by-case analysis of what the employee is required to do for their work.
Is that the case now?
It is.
It is the
Absolutely.
case now. So, and I guess
nothing has changed there, but I think in terms of whether or not an employer is implementing a policy right now to restrict the use of cannabis, they have to remember they can't impose a total ban without giving some consideration to whether or not there is a disability, an underlying disability that needs accommodation.
Okay. Can employers set rules around marijuana usage by their employees, including the kind of marijuana being consumed? Because that's important. There's different strains of marijuana that have different effects. Can they say, here's what we expect and here's what's allowed? How far can they go?
No, I don't think that would be up to the employer to determine. That would rather be the medical practitioner who should be recommending what type of cannabis may be used to treat the medical condition. But then it would be up to the employer to determine whether or not they could accommodate that use in or around their workplace.
And what happens if they feel they can't? This becomes the possible conflict area, right?
Exactly. So it's the duty to accommodate goes to the point of undue hardship, and that will take into account, first and foremost, health and safety considerations. So all provinces have occupational health and safety regulations that an employer has to take every precaution that is reasonable in the circumstances to protect the safety of their workers. So, if there's a safety concern in particular, then that may be enough to say, sorry, we can't have any cannabis that contains, for instance, THC, that, could impair your ability to perform the work safely.
Do you suspect more employers will want to look at testing, for instance, and just because they want to, can they?
Right. So generally speaking, I mean, drug testing in the workplace is fraught with danger. It can be appropriate, again, when there's a health and safety concern, so in a safety-sensitive position, or in particular if there's been an issue with drug use in the workplace.
What's the obligation of an employer who, I mean, the instinct in some cases, if you see an employee in the workplace you think may be drug impaired, the instinct in some cases would be to fire that employee. Is it that simple?
It would not be. So again, having a workplace policy that specifically precludes use of recreational marijuana or showing up to work impaired, unless they've come forward with, telling the employer that they require it for a medical reason. That would help in terms of disciplining the employee. But then there's also, it might trigger a duty to inquire, that the employer has a duty to inquire, is there an underlying problem here?
Right.
Perhaps there's an addiction issue. And that then would suggest that perhaps the employer should take a step back and see how else can we accommodate this employee. Perhaps they need to be sent home and seen by a doctor, and you may require, having to give them some time off to seek treatment.
I mean, there are a lot of employees who go out for lunch and have a beer at lunch and then go back to work. Can employees go out for lunch and smoke a joint at lunch and then come back to work?
Well, again, I think unless you impose a policy that suggests otherwise, they could. So that's where,
And can you impose a policy that says when you go to lunch you can't have a glass of wine, you can't?
Absolutely,
yeah,
you could, because that is considered still during the workday, and presumably they would suffer some impairment for several hours after consuming.
So let me ask you, do you think workplaces in this country are ready for this change? I mean, it's been talked about for a couple of years. Do you think most workplaces are ready or kind of not ready?
So I don't think many workplaces are prepared with proper policies in place. However, by the same token, I'm not sure how many employees will actually go out and consume over the lunch hour.
So it may not be. We'll wait and see. It may not be a problem, but best to be prepared if there is a problem, I guess.
Correct.
All right, Karin Pagé, thanks for your time.
Thank you.